today we are here to have a conversation about world building. And as I said, I'm grateful to have Bernette Sherman with us. We've done an event years ago together, but I've certainly followed everything that you've done for years because you stay very busy. And just to kind of summarize some of what Bernette has done. I mean, she's been featured in the Blue Mountain Review, Dissident Voice, Wheel of Life magazine. She if it's a genre, she will write it. And she has written books in fantasy, urban fantasy, sci-fi. She's got novellas, she's got historical fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and just to throw a little cap on that, she's gone and written a couple of plays that have been very well received. So I think if there's any area of writing that I want to ask questions about, I think you have to actually be able to answer it at this point.
Oh no.
But we're going to focus on world building today because world building is kind of wrongly always assumed to be something that is specific to fantasy or sci-fi, because you're actually creating a brand new world and political structure and everybody that's on there. But world building is actually a part of any style of writing that you do, even if it's nonfiction, because you have to be able to define the world in which the event takes place, the people that are in the world, whether it's the political landscape or the religious landscape or the military landscape or whatever it happens to be. There are definitions that have to be created in every world that is written about, so that the reader can fully immerse themselves into it. And so for this one, we're gonna kind of generalize the questions, because we're going to see if they apply to all of the genres you work in, or if they're just different, if they differ for each one.
That'll be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so she doesn't even know what her answer is. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what I say. Okay. But I mean, the easiest place to start here is like, what is world building to you?
That's a great question, because as you said, a lot of people think world building when they're thinking about fantasy and science fiction, but every story you have to create your version or vision of the world. And so I think it's creating the environment that holds everything else. So before you can put your characters in, the plot and everything, you have to have the world as kind of under the foundation as the infrastructure, I think. Because then you can put everyone in and you know that that world is going to influence them. At the same time, they kind of influence that world. And so to me, it's creating that environment that everything else is going to sit on.
Gotcha. So when you're starting the process of world building, what is the area that you like to focus on first? Is it the world itself? Is it the people that are in it? Is it the story that brings the world together?
I think it depends on the story. For me, every story comes in a different way. Sometimes I'll have a dream, and then that becomes a story. An idea pops into my head. I'll see something or I'll hear something, and it could be character, it could be a person who, I have this vision of them trying to accomplish something, and I'm like, well, what setting do they do this in? For example, Light of the Dark Moon. We were in, my daughter, she's here with me, we were in Jamaica last year for her birthday, and I was there and I was like, this is the world. Like, this landscape is what I had seen and visualized for this story before I had actually started writing it. I was thinking about like the different regions and how those interact with the people and how, their livelihoods and the political systems. But the landscape itself, when we went there, I was like, this is it. And when we came home, I was able to start like creating it and really thinking about those four regions and how each of them differed, but how they were still part of the same alliance. And then I was able to put the people into those regions based on who they were and what personalities they were going to have, as well as like what they're part of the story. Obviously, they're part of the story. Whereas like in other stories, like my novellas, for example, sometimes one of them is based on a real place. It's based on Atlanta. I didn't have to create a whole lot to tell that story. But you're going to have different things that may not exist, that people may not know about, that you're putting in, you're creating. But sometimes if it's based on something real, obviously it's a lot easier to bring people into that world versus something where you are creating you're creating a whole new environment
Mm-hmm.
from what may not exist. This is not on Earth. So I had to think about, like, what does it mean if you're not on Earth? Because we're humans, we do have to have something that relates. So, there's still Earth-like beings, human-like beings, and they have um, things that are similar to us, but their planet doesn't act just like ours.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you just have to go different. Every story is going to demand something different.
Yeah. Well, with Light of the Dark Moon, how much of our world, whether we're talking politics, religion, or whatever happens to be, current events, how much of that do you end up putting into the story?
I took an approach with this one where it's inspired by the African diaspora, and it's a world where everyone, they don't have race, but everyone is brown or is someone of a BIPOC, but they've never known anything else. That's just that world, that planet um, is that way. But they have other issues. When you can remove that as a thing, and I think in this world, a lot of times race can be the thing. Here, it's not, because everyone's everyone is that thing, but you still have kingdoms, which I call eardoms. You have leaders, you have power struggles, you have relationships, people wanting to, match with someone else for whatever reasons. And sometimes it's for love and power. You have magic, which we have some in this world. But it goes a little bit, more where, it's physical magic where you can levitate something or, but there's touches because we have to relate. It has to be relatable. Otherwise, people are going to be like, what are you talking about? So you still have politics, you still have religion, spirituality. The Light of the Dark Moon. The Dark Moon is actually seen by them as something very spiritual. And there's power and there's magic and there's relationships. So there's all of that. It's just in the place, not here.
Yeah.
And some of the rules are different.
Oh, okay. That's cool. I always like to keep these things informal. So if you all have questions as we go along, please feel free to raise your hand and let us know. No need to wait until the end. I know that I don't have the breadth of genres and styles that you write in, but I know that there's fantasy and then there's the fiction that I write, and I have favorites, in terms of the writing. But I'm curious with the world building itself. You talked about how there is a little bit of a different approach for each one.
Mm-hmm.
From a world building standpoint, what genre do you enjoy creating from? And that's not what do you enjoy writing, but it's the world building aspect.
Probably the science fiction and fantasy, because you get to make the world as you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be based on what we currently have. You can do whatever you want. In Star Jumpers, I created 3 worlds.
Mm-hmm.
That was like, when she jumped from one place to another, it's a whole different place.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a whole different political system and rules.
Yeah.
Jump someplace else and it's a whole different thing. And so it was a lot of fun thinking about, what does this place act like? What do the people like? What's the physical environment like? Why is it different than what they might be used to?
Yeah.
But also, what can we learn from it? I think one of the things with world building is you have an opportunity to highlight some of the great things that we might see in our environment, but also some of the things that we wish we might not have so much of, or we wish were different. And you can call attention to it without necessarily saying, pointing fingers at the reality of what we're living in. It's a fictionalized place, but you can draw attention that people can make connections to, oh, yeah, but this sounds familiar. We always do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's always a fascinating part of it is to be able to I kind of stuck on the thing you talked about with Light of the Dark Moon and removing race from it, because that's an interesting philosophical question as to what would we be if we could remove race from that, and you were able to explore that in that world.
Yeah.
That sounds very cool. Like that.
It was. It's like, because once you took it off the table, everything else is on the table.
Yeah. And I think that's world building kind of gives you that ultimate what if platform, in terms of, well, what if it was like this? What if the world was this? What if this was religion? So
yeah,
it's very fascinating place to start. So there's the world, there's the dynamics of the world, and then there are characters.
Yes.
And the characters obviously are a very important part of a story. It wouldn't be much of a story without them. So I'm kind of curious about your character creative process and how you go about it, and are you trying to fill an archetype, or are you just creating characters that you feel are best for the story? And I feel like we can play a fun exercise off this, but I want to hear your answer first.
It's interesting. I would say I think I've gotten better at this over time. We're always learning and growing and doing all of this world building, writing stories. I'm hopefully getting better as I do it more. That's the goal, right?
So, otherwise your career will let you know if you are not.
Let me know. But for the most recent one, the characters, I wanted them to be able to move through the story realistically and in ways that people could relate to. So when I started this, the initial storyline was different, right? I had thought about how they were going to do this, what the inciting incident was going to be, all of this stuff. And I think I wrote like 15 pages, just ideas about like this world and the characters and how they interacted. And then I started writing. And the characters, though, I did do a better job of being intentional about creating their personalities. And I started with like a chart with their name. I actually researched names and what they meant, trying to make sure that their names actually mean something. And that, I think names are important, especially when, names are important. They have a meaning. And so every time you're calling someone's name, you're calling that meaning. You're saying that. And I researched that, and then I said, okay, the birth order is important. What are the family dynamics like? What are their fears, their hopes, their dreams? Because everybody has motivation. But we always think of, like, I'm going to go save the world. But why? Because not everybody wants to save the world to be a hero. Some people want it to get their parents' approval. Somebody just wants to be accepted. So what's the reason behind the reason? And there's always like, everyone has the top level goal, and then there's the, emotional win, the spiritual win. There's all these different levels that people are working on at the same time. And with this one, I wanted, at least for the main characters, I wanted to infuse that in, that they are multi-dimensional people. And, I would write about them, not in the book, but like just talking about them. In that one, in a different example, in the play I did, where I had like 8 characters, all of them got a like 2-page character info sheet, which included their name, their birthday, where they're from, their favorite color, foods, idiosyncrasies, just some casual thoughts about them. Like, how would they behave in this situation? What's their phrase? You remember, now I did this before Free Guy came out. Remember catchphrase and Free Guy? But like, what's the sentence that kind of summarizes their personality? And doing something like that, so you really get to know them. Because once you do that, I think you start hearing them. I know I'm not the only writer who hears them, and like you'll be doing something like
Yes,
eating dinner.
you're
I'm the
actually
only
you're
one. I'm the only one.
you
let's,
yeah.
let's be real. We're all
Far too
hearing
many
voices.
far too many conversations in my head. Yes.
Yes, so many conversations. And you start talking like them. So you really know that you're getting to know your characters when like you're going to respond to somebody and you think of the response in the voice of that character, you know?
I'll one up you on that, and I've told this story before, so some people might have heard this, but when I get stuck and I'm having trouble trying to figure out what a character is going to do next, I have a tendency to just stop what I'm doing, open up a document, and interview the character. Like I'll just completely, you know, let it go and just ask a question and let the character answer. And I know it's really ridiculous to, again, we were talking about, people understanding writers. So writers will understand this. Other people kind of look at me like, you might have a problem. But I have learned more about the stories and more about the characters just doing that stream of consciousness interview than I ever have sitting down, in world building. And
Yeah,
to the point that it's become a part of the world building process to
that's great.
just get to know the characters really well and then interview them and let them kind of surprise me.
I like
So
that.
yeah,
Interviewing them. I
yeah,
haven't tried that. I'll free flow in a document. Um, and it helps me kind of get to know them better, what they would do, their thought processes. But at the end of the day, I think every character is some figment of ourselves or people we know, you know.
or what we wish people
or,
would be.
or yeah, maybe some
Yeah,
idealized versions of that too.
yeah. Complete tangent off of world building, which we'll come back to, but I'm curious. You're talking about the plays and the information sheets, and it seems to me that writing characters for a play, kind of in sort of reinforces the show in the show versus tell because they're performing it.
Mhm.
It's a visual thing, and I'm curious if that has benefited you in your process of writing novels.
It has. So I did Four Wives and a Will in 2021. And that process of creating those characters and really being intentional about how I wanted them to be, what their energy was. When I went to go do this book, I was like, I need to do that again. So I was like, I learned from something.
Yeah, yeah.
I grew.
Yeah.
So I did. I took that and I was like, okay, let's repeat this for a book, especially since I had so many characters, um, more than 8 in the book.
Hmm.
You almost have to do that just to keep track. But I think it's helpful. It was helpful.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so we've talked about creating the world, creating characters, and when we get to like the political or sociological aspects of a world, what and let's just focus on Light of the Dark Moon right now.
Mhm.
What was your thought process in trying to create those landscapes?
So I knew I shouldn't say that. I started out with this idea of having multiple kingdoms. And at first I was like, I'm going to have 8. And I was like, let's be real. Let's be real. It's like, you got to create something for each of those. But then I realized that I needed 4. And if you see, there's behind her is this figure. And it's actually, and it's interesting. This is how writing works. Um, she's a Narret, and Sparaka is at the bottom, WE. So she is the princess, one of the princesses of Narret. And I wanted her to be a middle child. So she's got an older sister and a younger sister. Helps with family dynamics, right? Um, but everyone has a king or queen or both. They don't call them kings and queens, but they have other titles. And they went through something which is not in this book, but they had to come together to form an alliance. And it's been like 80 years because of the war. And so now one of the things that's holding them together is this commitment to work together, this commitment that despite the fact that we're in different places, we may be separated by water or, mountains, we are all collaborating to make this world, make our world work together. And that for me is a social statement, also a political statement, that just because you're divided by some kind of borders, if you think about, we all need each other, and they recognize that. And so they all work together. They all have different, each of their different kingdoms provide something special or different for the functioning of all of the Fatherwater realm and Maridobu itself, which is the alliance. So they're all working together. They all offer something unique and different to make their world work. And so I think that's, you have the environment, you've got the social, political of kings and queens, and who's going to marry who as far as the children to keep the alliances strong, and, people moving through, but also, as you know, with most kings and queens and kingdoms, when you try to do that too far, you sometimes run out of people that you can marry. And so the pickings are slim, which comes out. As far as the religion of it, they have a whole belief system around this dark moon, but they're not extremely religious about it. But there's this power that they understand to be associated with the dark moon, but it also gets challenged. So there's a lot of challenging of the status quo, the norms of what's expected, and sometimes what we believe, and what we even hope, and what we think we're supposed to do. Sorry. What we think we're supposed to do.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Questions so far? Nope.
Sorry, I put my first of all, congratulations on your success. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
This is not a question, but I do love that you said creating the environment that holds the characters, because I think that's hard to do sometimes, and making sure that almost like your environment is a character within your story. And my question was, when you were writing the fantasy worlds, and I know you said that here it was Jamaica. How much of the worlds do you come from thing you see from experience? If you've been to this place and you want to put this in the world, or how much is created just from your imagination? Like, oh, I'm just gonna create a completely different world, not someplace you've been or something.
Mm-hmm. So I would say for this one, the 4 main kingdoms is inspired by that I saw in Jamaica, which I had never seen before until we went there. But that was inspired by there. But there's a whole nother region, which is not part of the main Maridobu Alliance, Ziria, which is a magical world with unicorns and fairies and elves and all of that stuff. So that I created from my imagination. I saw this place that was just beautiful and magical, and that's what I created for that place. The colors and the sky, the water. I mean, that one, even though it's in this with other realistic things, it's like this whole other place that I created as a separate mini world inside of the world. Yeah. And I did a similar thing with in Star Jumpers, when they go to one of the planets, it's very different. It's like almost like, I've never been to Mars, but like very red and angry, and I saw it was just like, and I could see it in my mind's eye. I was like, I don't want to be here, but this is where you are, and this is the environment that's going to help you tell this part of the story. And so I think there is that part of it where you see it as a creative person, and that's what you're going to create that for your readers to experience, because that's the environment that's going to hold that piece of the story and move it forward, I think.
The question right here.
So what specific kinds of things did you see in Jamaica that kind of inspired you then to move forward with the process?
So we stayed in this hotel right off it sat between the ocean and the mountains. And to one side there was beach and sand, it was like rocky, and then you had the water in front of you, and in the distance you could see like the sunset, and it was the ocean and the mountains, that combination, which Narrett is in the mountains. And so I expanded that, obviously, because wasn't enough space there to work 4 regions in. But you had the mountains, you had agriculture areas. And so I created that mountain experience, those near the water in Sparaka, near the bottom in the south, and then Walleran to the west, and they're bordered by water as well, but they have agriculture. And then there's Emervie, who also has agriculture, but a different type. They do more forestry. And so because our environments work together, that's one of the things. They work together. So yeah, you have the mountains, but they flow into the ocean. And what happens up there is going to impact what happens down below. And so I think for that one, when I saw that, because I've literally been trying to sketch this idea in my head before we went. And then we went, and I was just like, this is it. Like, this is what I was trying to see. And then I was able to create everything else. It just gave me that spark of like, I have something to work with for that part. Yeah. Yeah.
So the characters in these different regions, because you're intentional with it, especially now as you improved as a writer, you make sure that wherever they're from, that impacts the character they are.
Yes.
Okay.
So they all have different, I don't want to call them gifts, but they have different ways of being based on the area that they're from, because each area is kind of powered by certain stones. So gems, jewels, crystals, whatever. And that's going to influence the energy of that region. And so in Narrett, it's red. Redstone, they have different names than what we have names for here, but that powers them. And it gives them a different kind of energy than someone in Sparaka, which is blue. And so they have different stones. And actually, so when I started writing, this is just some of my notes: fantasy, like novel, and world info, just so I could keep sense of it. And I actually printed this out really big and put it on not a whiteboard, poster board things. And so when I was writing, I could go back and refer to it. And I just had each of them stacked out, because otherwise I was like, it's a lot of information to try to hold. But for example, so it's printed out really small, but this is the first version. And on my written one, I printed out and hung up. I had things crossed out and rewritten, but I had each of the regions. So you had Sparaka, Emervie, Walleran, and where's the 4th one? And Narrett. And so those, and then also what became Ziri. And so each of them has the king and the queen, the children, a site, which is like their, it's their spiritual guide kind of person. And then they have a special color, a stone, what their station is known for, like farmlands or mountains, what they provide for the region, and then anything special, like, for example, Walleran provides golden nectar, which is a very special drink made from the tata fruit. That's pretty, highfalutin when you're at fancy parties. So I did that for each of the regions, so that when I was writing, I could make sense and keep people grounded in the baseline of where they were from, because it impacts their behavior just like where we're from impacts how we show up in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, curious because you've got the printouts here and you're talking about hanging them up and everything. Do you have a program that you use to compile all of your information, or are you just like strictly documents and printing?
I wish I could say I was fancy. Word and Google Docs. These were done in Google Docs. Google Docs, and I would write it, and then I printed it out and put it on the
Yeah, I
board.
mean, there isn't a right answer to that. It's
Yeah.
whatever works for you. I
No,
was just curious
yeah.
what your process was.
I know some people do use the writing programs, and they have like ways of like keeping everything organized. But I was like, once it's in there, I still got to have it. I need to have it in front of me.
Hmm.
I was like, I may as well just type it up and put it in front of me.
And then you take a little yarn and you stretch it across and you get your serial killer map.
Maybe one day I'll get there.
There you go. I'll ask you a difficult question, or at least I believe it to be a difficult question, because it's always hard to pick favorite anythings. But of the worlds that you have created so far, what is your favorite? What is the one that you would want to be in?
I would want to go to Syria. I would want to go there. Yeah.
Is it the magic?
Yes. Yes.
Is it just because of the magic, or is there something else about it that you?
So it's a made up world, but I'm like, oh my God, it was
such it's my number one travel destination.
I want to go there. It was so amazing. Like, it was beautiful. It was peaceful, and people were able to rule themselves in a different way. They didn't have kings and queens there. They had an elected government. But they also had they had their own issues of like the Mer people were concerned about equal access to different things like schools when their children couldn't get into the regular schools because they live in water. Like, you have things like that, right? So you still have issues no matter where you go. But that world, I loved.
Yeah.
It's like I could have spent more time there, but she had to leave.
I find that those worlds call to you, and there will be more stories.
Maybe I could probably write something just on that, like that one. I'm just like, I guess it's time for her to keep on with her adventure. She's got to leave. But that one, I would go there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the story of Irvin James, which is your work of nonfiction. And
it is actually fiction. It's historical fiction.
It's historical fiction.
But it's based on
okay, well,
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So it is based on real world person and events, but it's fictionalized.
Yeah.
So in the world building process, that's very different than fantasy and sci-fi. What were the difficulties for you?
Well, the 1800s.
No personal frame of reference.
Yeah, 1800s. It was interesting because we kind of have information about that, for the general world aspect of it. So I didn't have to create anything new. I just had to be able to understand that landscape that everybody was in. So that foundational environment that was holding all of these characters was the early to mid 1800s. And Irvin James is my great grandfather. And so I was telling his story in a fictionalized manner. I used a lot of research as much as I could, but as you know, Blacks were not allowed to document their stories. So there wasn't any written way of getting this information. I will say that I happened to be a medium in the channel, so I did use that gift to help me tell his story and the story. So building, though, the environment, I took him, had to start someplace. I took him from a trip walking from Virginia to South Carolina and showed that part. And then in South Carolina, I had to visualize what it was like in that slave market. And that was, I mean, that was a difficult like visualization experience, but to say, okay, this is the framework of the world that he was coming into. That's going to shape the character. That's going to shape his relationship with everybody else that he's going to engage with from now on. And so it wasn't so much as world building as world understanding. Yeah, I would say it's probably world understanding, understanding who he was in that place and what the world was like at that time.
And then following that up, the research question, and I guess the question is, how much different is the research for a real world setting versus that of a fantastical world? And I say that like so for example, I'll qualify research as like if I have a question about a castle and in this fantasy world and I need to know a specific type of the castle, I'm on the internet looking up, give me a diagram, and so I make sure I say this correctly, right? So what is the difference for you in difficulty or in the actual work in researching something that's real world versus fantasy?
It was a lot harder to research real world because any of you could go out there and be like, I'm gonna go fact check. Right? I'm gonna go fact check. Versus if I made it up, I made it up.
Mm-hmm.
It's mine. You can't tell me I'm wrong because it's a fantasy world and it's my rules. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the real world setting, it's real. Like I can't say that that there was a lot that happened in the 1800s. And so it was harder, but it was also very interesting because I learned a ton telling his story. Just researching him, like I took him from the South to the North and understanding what was happening in the North when he would have been there. And the in Philadelphia area and burning down of whole Black neighborhoods and the riots and then the changing tide and the efforts of freedom, and then what does freedom really mean? All of this happening, and there's real people that I could reference. There's all of this history that I could reference, and some of them were people who he would not have directly interacted with, but some of them were people that he would have known and loved. Yeah.
Questions?
So did you go to Charleston while you were writing this book and to those various places, or was this done more virtually?
It was partly done. It was done more virtually. Mm-hmm. But I'd been so there's an area in South Carolina called Jamestown. It's in Florence. If you ever go to Myrtle Beach, you will pass it. You'll drive right through Florence, and there's a place that has a mile marker called Jamestown. That is where the community that my great-great-great-grandfather founded. So that was there. I was able to do research about the founding of that community, him using census data and all of that. The Charleston thing, no, I know that Charleston was a very, very busy port, bringing in enslaved Africans. It was very busy. So that's pretty much documented, unless people try to undocument it. It's been documented. So I didn't necessarily need to go there. And honestly, I didn't want to. So that was more virtual and just understanding it and seeing it as well.
I love that book, by the way.
Oh,
that was just a wonderful journey with Urban. I just really,
you read it?
Yes. It's really wonderful book, wonderfully written. It felt very authentic. I felt like I was going somewhere, not just back in time, but to a different location. Yeah, it was really, I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That one, near and dear you know, it's a family story of struggle but resilience. Yeah.
It had been a little difficult writing about your family in the past. Also knowing as a Black woman that history can be pretty fraught.
Yeah.
Was that emotionally really difficult for you?
It was. It was. There were times where I'm typing and bawling at the same time, you know. But it was also one of those stories that just spilled out. Like I was telling their story. And if you read it, you notice there's different voices. And they would wake me up at night, be like, you need to write my story next. You need to write my chapter next. You need to tell this part next. And I wrote the whole thing in like 5 or 6 weeks. Like, wow. Yeah. Because I was just like, I couldn't stop because they were always on. Right. But it was very intense in that way, but also because of the content and the history and just learning of what it was like, but also the struggle, but also this hope, this push-pull. There's a lot of different dynamics.
So since you're writing about family, what was the response you got from family that read it?
They love it.
I mean, they're family, they're supposed to.
You're supposed to,
Yes.
right?
Otherwise,
Yeah. But yeah, they do. They like the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because we didn't have a way of telling this. We didn't have a story. We had bits and pieces, especially once you got to Jamestown. Once Jamestown actually was founded, then there was more history because it was active through the 50s. And then people started moving up north for better opportunities. But people had those stories, but not necessarily the story of him coming through to that point of founding that. And that's really the story. This story is him coming through to that point of founding Jamestown.
No, go right ahead.
So, like you mentioned with this current story, and then also with Dark Moon, just like different character voices and like different areas that people are coming from. When you're writing, how do you make them sound distinct from one another? And like, I mean, with the 4 different regions, I'm sure they approach the way that they communicate with others in different ways too.
So I tried, because I've read some things about like doing that too much, that you don't do that too much, but I did not try to make them all sound like Sparakan sound this way. And there are certain characters who have distinct ways of speaking. And because most of the characters are royals, they have a distinct way of speaking. And you can tell, like when they get upset or tense, they get very formal, you know. And you know that you've offended them when they get to speaking very proper again. And you know, yeah. But at the same time, there's like Nantu, she's one of the sites. She never contracts, does contractions. And so all of her words are full.
Well, and I was thinking also just like what they're saying versus like how they're saying it.
Okay.
So not necessarily dialect, but
But what they're saying.
Yeah, like just making them sound like, I don't know, the way that I would communicate is different than the way my husband communicates, just because of our backgrounds and
Yes.
how we approach those situations. So it's kind of differentiating characters, I think.
So you will have that from more of I want to say a family dynamic. And so, or the kingdom households. So the way, for example, Blatunda speaks, she's going to be different. You'll know just the way she always sounds a little bit snide, because she's the, you know, oldest daughter of the only Ajurdam ruled by a woman. And so like she has this different idea about herself and what she wants. So you have like that kind of thing. And each of the kingdoms, the people who live in there, they're going to be different. I did not do a lot of in the dialect of them, more in how their energy and how they act.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, Urban James, it was, I would call it not authentic, it was real dialect. Yeah, I wrote that without using tags. So there's no dialogue tags in it. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing.
Was that
Yeah.
really hard to write in dialect throughout the whole thing?
There were times if I got in the way, it was. If I just let them speak, it wasn't. But if I like my mind turned on, I was like, wait, this should be a close quote. Yeah, but as long as they led the way, it wasn't.
And writing without tags, which he said, she said, tags.
Now I did do so Southern South Carolina dialect. I was born in South Carolina, have family there who still speaks very much similarly to the way I could hear his voice speaking. So, for example, I would say he said. I never use the quotations, comma, he said. I would say something like, you ain't going around here, he said, S-A-Y-E-D. Because in my head, he's not
So
saying
you keep
said.
it in the dialect.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Wow.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
That part
Was
sometimes
that organic or something planned?
when I started writing it, I started writing with text. I was like, I can't do this. It doesn't feel right trying to, because it was breaking up the flow. Like he's talking the way he talks, and then suddenly it's comma, he said. I was like, no,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't do that. So I had to go back probably after the first chapter. I was like, we're getting rid of that. I'm gonna write it in his voice.
Yeah.
In the voice of the people who are telling the
Very
story.
interesting.
And I actually wrote in the very beginning, I talk about that because I know. Like I think I talk about like why I did it and how, so that people could understand when they go into it, this is what you're getting.
Yeah, because people tend to feel a certain way about things.
People tend to feel strongly about certain things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're running close to the end of time, but I want to make sure there aren't any other questions, and I do want to now circle back to the cover because it's a fantastic cover on Light of the Dark Moon.
Okay.
And where did this come from?
So I'm an indie author. I designed this cover. I searched so long to find a woman to represent Lafia. Once I got her, I was like, okay, now I can design the cover. I designed this image. I'm gonna just, because there's a glossary. You can kind of see it in the back. This is what the actual image looks like. And so that's the image of the Alliance. That's the symbol of the Alliance. And so I designed that. I was like, that needs to be on the cover. There's this little border is inspired kind of by like African fabric cloths around the back. The dark moon, the fog is all these are elements in the book. One of the things that fog is, if you read it, you'll understand. And the red symbolizing her. She's in the region that's represented by red. And so Canva.
Oh, Canva is the greatest.
Yes.
There is no program that exists.
Yeah.
There's no program that exists that makes people look like professionals better than Canva.
I know. And
Because I
love
started
it.
doing some stuff for books that have come out, and the last one I did, I was like, oh, that looks good.
It does.
It's like
you can
this
do a lot.
little publisher me from like 2 years ago that was doing all the stuff with publisher and getting frustrated all the time. Yeah, it would have never.
Yeah.
Never done that.
This has been a game changer, I will say. And just the more the more I do them, like I did all but Star Jumpers. I've done all my covers except for Star Jumpers. Yeah.
Any other questions? Go
Yeah.
for it.
So with the magic systems and developing that, how do you go about it?
So this is the, I want to say, no, I guess Star Jumpers didn't have magic, but had gifts. So in this one, did I write that one down in here? So yeah, magic system, psychic and functional. So they had a psychic, they were psychic. So they had Clar, C-L-A-R, coming from Claire, which we might be familiar with, but they had different gifts. And the women primarily had these gifts. And as you go through, we challenge some of the norms that they had. I won't get into that. So, but the women and the royal women, pretty much, they had these special magical abilities that they should be able to tap into and tune into. And around 16 years old, they're supposed to really develop them. And at 20, they're supposed to do their demonstration of magic, at which point they're eligible to court and to start dating, basically. But you're not supposed to do that until you pass your demonstration of magic, and then you can be ineligible, which is her problem. She didn't pass it. So that starts kind of the system of magic. So men, they can use magic and they can do some summoning, but they don't have all the gifts of the Claire. The sites, who are those spiritual people who come, they're actually from Ziri. So they're assigned from Ziri. Ziri lets them come and help the Meridovans, and every kingdom gets a site to help them with their spiritual work and their magic. And so in this world, it's just normal. If you're royal, you've got magic. It's in you. And you're expected at some point to come into it and to be able to use it reliably. Yeah. To keep it as reliable.
And
It's on fire, but I don't have any control.
And it is important, if you're developing a system of magic, to understand the rules. You can't just say there's magic for the sake of magic. So
No, yeah.
so that's really cool.
And there's certain things you have to do in a certain way. And
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Now we are going to transition over in a few minutes to our monthly meeting, and Bernette's going to hang around for that, so she'll be here. There are copies of Light of the Dark Moon that FoxTale is selling.
Yes.
So please do purchase that, support this wonderful author, and she'll be happy to sign them for you. Thank you, Bernette.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate the
I
time.
appreciate it. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for the great questions.
Yeah.
You guys made me think.
Yeah, thank you everybody for the questions.
Yeah.
Thank you to
Thank you so
FoxTale,
much.
and let's go buy some books.